All right, Wolf Hollow, chapter 26. It didn't take long for Mrs. Gribble to spread this piece of news. People often complained about her eavesdropping and swore they didn't listen to her gossip. But the story she spread had always proven true, except one April Fool's, when someone fed her a bogus tale about a wagon train of gypsies setting up camp in Bachtown, and she was widely regarded as a country crier. By supper time, everyone knew that Toby was not responsible for Ruth losing her eye, and there was now some doubt about whether he'd pushed Betty down the well. But doubt wasn't enough. A jury can have doubt if it wants to, the constable said, but the police still have to find the man. He sat in our kitchen with my father and grandfather, and even James for once at the table instead of under it. The dogs had led the search party into the barn and out again, across the pastures and around the house, up the lane and back down into the woods, the orchards, before finally setting a course away from our hills, west towards Ohio, which was not very far from here. They'd followed the scent for a couple miles, maybe more, before Officer Coleman declared this certain trail unlikely to loop back. That's when he sent us home, my father said. They're still on the trail and will stay on it until they're relieved by fresh dogs and men. Constable Oleska looked worn out and not at all sorry to be done with searching. They're sure to catch up with Toby in a day or two unless he hitches a ride. Do you think they'll go into Ohio after him, my father said. Yes, I expect they will, or hand it over to the Ohio police. But when they hear Annie's last bulletin, and they will if they haven't already, they're apt to stand down a bit. He turned to look at me. I guess it's a good thing Mrs. Gribble listened in on that call you made to Andy, he said. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't scolding either. Imagine her doing that. Imagine you doing that, my father said to me. Are you angry? I was prepared for both people to be angry with me, though it didn't matter as it once would have. Not angry, my father said. Not angry at all, my grandfather said. He smiled at me from his end of the table. Gumption's a good thing, if you ask me. So is industry, as my mother said as she slid a pan of pork chops into the oven. Annabelle, those carrots are not going to peel themselves. I'll do it, Henry said, rising from his chair. He didn't look at me as he took his customary place at the sink, but I knew he could see me anyway. We had the same hands, the same long fingers, the same way of holding a knife. How come Henry gets to help and I don't, James said. You're absolutely right, my mother handed him a saucepan. You can start by putting a cup of milk onto this pan. Aunt Lily had just come home, and then to the sight of Henry and James helping to get supper ready while I sat at the table with the men. Am I in the right house, she said. She took off her coat and hung it to the mudroom closet. Annabelle, have you lost the use of your legs? Easy, Lily, my father said, as if she were a fractious horse. It's been a long day. As if I don't know it. Do you have any idea how much mail comes through that post office? It's a wonder anything gets done around here with all those letters people write. She helped herself to a cup of coffee and sat down at my mother's place. The thought that she had somehow missed the news of Betty's death, so I told her. Betty Glengarry died this morning, Aunt Lily. Which I heard from at least a dozen people today, she said. I don't work at the Timco post office, Annabelle, if there even is such a thing. I wanted to throw something at her. I thought you might want to know. Why? Because I'm not gasping and fainting like all the other ninnies? She looked at me over her glasses. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Annabelle. He has his reasons. My grandmother came into the kitchen just in time to hear this. Reasons for what? For taking Betty home. My grandmother shook her head. I didn't know where you got such a hard heart, Lily. Not hard, but not soft either. Plenty of those around here already. I thought if I had to listen to Aunt Lily for one more minute, I would turn to stone. Since the boys are helping with supper, can I go to my room for a while? For a little while, my mother said. I'll call you when I need you. I can set the table, James said. Of course you can, my grandmother cooed, ruffling his hair. Whoever said you couldn't? From my bedroom, I could hear the others down below. The sounds of pots and pans, dishes and flatware, voices, a chair scraping, all of which had the effect of making me feel even more lonely. Tricking Andy into a confession, knowing that police might be more gentle with Toby if they caught him, did not help much. From my closet, I took my grandfather's coat and slipped it on. There was room inside for 2 of me. I laid down on my bed, drew my knees up into the coat, and fell sound asleep. I didn't hear my mother call me down for supper. I didn't hear her open my bedroom door or turn off my light. I didn't hear her pull my bedspread up over me. I didn't even wake later that night at the sound of the telephone ringing. After such an early bedtime, I was up well before most of anyone. I found my mother up in the kitchen brewing coffee, but no one else. The world was dark beyond the windows. I watched her for a moment. She looked different, but not knowing anyone was there, all of her facing inward as I had on the path when Toby took my picture. An inkling told me to go back to bed before she saw me. Perhaps that was how she looked, though I couldn't see her face. That urged me to go away quickly so I could have another hour, maybe 2, before I found out why. I was still in my clothes from the day before, still wearing my grandfather's coat. How silly I must have looked when she turned towards me, a mug of coffee in her hand, and stopped so suddenly that the coffee sloshed over the rim and onto the floor. "Annabelle, you startled me," she said, reaching for a rag. "What are you doing up so early?" I couldn't sleep anymore. I sat down at the table. "Did they find Toby yet?" "You heard the telephone ring?" I shook my head, my heart shrinking. "Who called?" My mother rinsed out the rag and sat across from me. She set her mug down carefully. "The constable called," she said. "He had just heard from Officer Coleman, and he thought we'd want to know what happened." I didn't know how beautiful my mother was until I saw her in that moment, and she gathered herself to tell me that Toby was dead. I held my hands inside the sleeves of my grandfather's coat when she told me that they had caught up with him just before the border of Ohio, sleeping under the Mahoning River Bridge. She told me that when the hounds reached them, they laid down in the leaves along the edge of the river and took no interest in the man himself, who stood up when the policeman called his name. Perhaps she said he wanted to be standing when the next part came, because when they told him to lie down again on his face and put his hands behind him, he refused. And when they pulled out their pistols and told him a second time, he slipped one of the long guns off his back, and they shot him. They didn't know his gun was useless, she said, quietly. They didn't know anything about what had happened here. They only knew that they were supposed to catch a dangerous man and take him into custody. I pushed the coat's long sleeves up my arms and dried my face with my hands. "Why would they do that?" I said. "Grab his gun like that?" "Why would he do that?" I said. "Grab his gun like that? It didn't even work. And Toby wouldn't have shot at them anyway. He just wouldn't." My mother sighed. "I don't think so either," she said. "And I don't know why he did what he did, except for maybe he had had enough of this world, Annabelle. After all of this time of living with how sad he was, he decided he couldn't stay here anymore now, when he had us." My mother shook her head. "I don't know, Annabelle. But think about how it feels when your hands are so cold they go numb. How it's only when they start to thaw out that you realize how much they hurt." I had spent some time looking at my hands and thinking about his. He said he would have liked to have a daughter like me. My mother smiled. Anybody would. I remembered that night I'd taken Toby to the barn for safekeeping. "Did you know he was afraid of heights?" She shook her head. "But I shamed him into climbing that loft ladder, and he never hesitated after that. Just did it, like it was nothing." My mother got up and poured me a small cup of coffee with plenty of cream and sugar. "You knew him better than I thought you did." "He knew me before I knew him." And we drank our coffee in silence as the sun came up through the windows and all the colors with it. Chapter 25.